and it's always a pleasure to be back here in Hyderabad. This time when Vikram wanted me to speak on something, I had decided that I will not speak on data. At least I will not speak anything technical in that sense. And part of the reason was not that I had any doubts on the wisdom of the audience, or I thought that that is something which is I'm not very confident at presenting. But I started thinking about what exactly does it mean? What exactly are we talking about? And that is when its whole story about data and its discontents, in a sense, started with. I could have said it as data and democracy or whatever, which is what actually is this whole story is all about. Why talk about it at this point of time on data? I mean, one is obviously that there is now an explosion of data that is coming from every sources, private sources, official sources, every source, everybody is. And I'm not talking about data is the new oil kind of a statement that is made by some corporates. I'm talking about really as, and this is happening everywhere in a sense. But as more and more data is becoming more and more available, you also realize the data is also becoming more and more difficult to get. So there is a problem of really getting data when there is a plenty of data that is available. Actually, it's not data that I wanted to speak about, it is about the statistics, the official statistics in that sense. And in a sense, loosely, we talked about data in a sense because it comes in different ways. And today's reason why I wanted to speak to you about the official statistics particularly is that perhaps the official statistics have never been under attack in the same manner as has been the last 70 to 80 years. And it goes before that. Our official statistics, effort to improve official statistics goes before independence. A lot of people actually worked on this. But particularly after independence, and the statistical system was actually founded in 1950, exactly the same time when the Republic was founded. And it has built a reputation for itself. Everywhere, right from the Nobel Prize winners to, I mean, if you go to any statistical system, in most of the developed countries, you will keep hearing stories about how India builds a statistical system. And that desire to build a statistical system didn't come because we wanted to be the number one. We wanted to be the Vishwaguru, to become the data scientist in that sense. It was because the Indian economy or Indian society at that point of time was in a situation where the challenges were quite different from the nature of statistics that was being done in other countries, developed countries particularly. So this was a kind of a homegrown attempt at creating a system of official statistics, which basically was not just interested in producing numbers as such, but trying to understand what exactly were the problems that India was facing at that point of time, because it was felt that you can't have a solution unless you know what the problem is. So diagnosis was very important in that sense. The second thing which basically made it very different in that sense was that it got full support from the state, the government in that sense, but no interference from the state. In the sense, the state allowed the statistical system to develop on its own. And it became a role model, and it became a role model for quite a long period of time. Even today, despite all its shortcomings, it still remains one of the most respected statistical systems in the world, built by people who are largely unknown. Nobody knows a statistical officer, nobody knows who is the chief statistician of India, or for example, how the statistical system functions. But they keep churning out statistics day in and day out. The discontent was basically because of what is going on as far as the statistical system is concerned. I mean, a general talk of the town is that in the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, whatever time period that you want to take, some of our best institutions have come under attack. And they have come under attack in different forms. I mean, obviously, the people talk about a lot about the political system, the executive system. Now there is a lot of discussion on how the judicial system is under attack. The judges have come out with a press conference, and there is a general complaint that the judicial system is under attack. I mean, nobody will be talking about the media because that more or less people have given up, that is a system which has collapsed in the sense that institution is no longer. But one institution which is still trying to fight and trying to put up a very, very strong fight is the official statistical system, and it's an important part of the democratic structure of the society. It is not just a standalone department. It is not something which is only to be used by the academicians or to be used by students who are trying to produce PhDs or research papers or other things. The official statistical system, or the statistical system in general in the country, is something whose evolution has to be understood in the same manner as you understand the evolution of Indian democracy. And it played a very, very important role in shaping up the democracy, in building up the democracy, and strengthening the basic structure of the democracy. And these are some of the issues that I wanted to highlight, wanted to raise as to how it has played a role over a long period of time, built up movements, created support to grassroots movements, have given them evidence to go on the street, demand certain rights, and those are things which have been achieved. It has been, some of the well-known examples obviously are the demand for example, NREGA. Not many people know. It was backed by a good kind of statistical evidence that came in the hand of the activists. And those were something which were used to mobilize people and to bring those issues in public domain. Or for example, the run-up to the enactment of the National Food Security Act. There was heated debate, and that debate was something which was again based on statistical evidence that was produced by the system. People fought tooth and nail, and there were obviously two sides of the debate. And it came out, this basically is, the courts took notice of it. The courts valued those official statistics, looked at those numbers very carefully, and they basically said that this is how it should be. For example, whether you should be using a targeted approach or a universal kind of approach, all of that was something where it was being used by people on the ground. People on the ground, I am meaning the illiterate person in the villages who was being mobilized on some of these issues with barely the number within hand, which most of them didn't understand how the data has been generated. But it proved an important source of mobilization. And that is something which has always been the case. It is not something which is a case that hasn't happened. And I can give you the example from the 1950s, 60s onwards up to the recent period, but the recent period obviously the examples are much more obvious. But that's something which is where things are coming to a difficult situation now. And we have now seen an attack which is multi-pronged in different ways. And what I have tried to define it is in a sense a three-pronged approach to really attacking the statistical system, what we call as deny. The second is obviously to discredit, and the third is to deflect or divert in a sense. We are now in a phase where denial has now become the first instrument, and this is something which is rare, and that is where the last 8-10 years are remarkably different from the earlier period. It's not that we didn't have the debate on the statistical system or the quality of statistical data, but never in the history of the statistical system has the government decided or taken a decision to deny any of the statistical data to public, because the data or the statistical data that has been collected does not belong to the government, it belongs to the public by an independent statistical system. And probably the most glaring example of this is what happened to the consumption expenditure survey, this survey which has been going on since 1950s. The first consumption survey was in 1950. Never has been ever the case that the consumption survey has been withdrawn in a sense. This was something which the government was sitting on, not allowing the release of the data. The data was completely ready, the report was ready, was approved by the National Statistical System, by all the government approved bodies, they were approved. Finally, it took the guts of a journalist to leak out the findings of the report, and the fastest that the government has ever worked. So morning the news report came, and by evening 5 o'clock a PIB release came out that the data cannot be used. A simple, nobody owning up as to who released the press release. Was it Ministry of Finance? Was it Ministry of Statistics? Was it the PMO? Nobody knew, but complete embargo that nobody can use the data. The entire survey itself was what we call a junk. So you can't use the survey. No explanation being given, no argument being given, but people knew in the leaked some numbers were available, and those were very clear, because for the first time in history they showed that the number of poor people in the country have increased. But this is not the first time that this kind of a question has come up. But no government before this has ever tried to simply stop the release of the data or stop the release of even the tabulated reports. And this was the first time that it had happened. When the data was available, released, everything was there, and withdrawn in 6 hours notice. 11 o'clock the finance ministry took note of it, and by 5 o'clock the notice was there, the press release was issued. That's an extreme case of when the data is collected, released, ready for release and everything, because the government was scared that the results will be. This was, by the way, after the 2019 elections, and the elections were already, the government had won, so there was nothing to be worried about it. But there was another incident before that, which is the employment survey, the periodic labor force survey, which is the basic annual employment survey that comes out. This was again withheld. Government refused to release it. Finally, the journalist had to really leak the data. The data was leaked in January 2019, and the government went on full swing saying that nothing like this. We are not going to release any of these data. But the elections were over, and within 5 days of the elections results being announced, the report was quietly released in the public, because the purpose was served. In the sense, as long as it didn't become an election issue, nobody was going to bother about what is going to happen. Now, this was the story of the employment survey. That is so far fine. We have now reached a situation where we are not likely to have even the survey. And I think the biggest example of the denial of basic data, which is the census. And if any of you are in the assumption that you are going to have the census data in the next 3 years, 4 years, you are not going to have the basic census data for the next 3 years. The minimum time period that the census takes to prepare for census rollout is 2 years, minimum. And they have said it very clearly that by next year elections, everybody will be busy, so we are not going to do it. So we'll start the process after next year elections. So probably have the census in 2026 or 27, and you will have the result ready maybe in 28, 29, we don't know. After independence, this is the first time that we are not going to have a census data. We are not going to even, and nobody is, this whole exercise that we can't have the census because there was COVID is, obviously you have to judge for yourself. We had the fiercest elections, we had the Kumbh, we had elections in different states, we organized everything that is possible under the sun, panchayat elections to all sorts of elections, to cricket matches, to everything that we could organize, but we can't organize the census. Because there you might catch COVID. But for all other programs, you are not likely to get COVID. So that's something which is there. Now I can list out a number of these data sources which are available, which has been denied. Let me give you one example of it. And before I go into that example of it, a brief roughly that what kind of data, what kind of statistics that we are talking about. Generally there are 3 kinds of official statistics that one talks about. Official meaning also private statistics that talks about people, we talk about. One is what we call as the survey data, which is that investigators go to the people, ask questions, and that's what they report. There are obviously in the the government machinery collects numerous data sources, surveys which are there. Private sources obviously are there. A lot of these election surveys are sample surveys, but many other surveys are there which are sample surveys. RBI does it, all sorts of people do it. The second is the census, which is like a decadal where everybody is counted, not a sampling in a sense. And the third one is what we call as the administrative data, which is the data which the government collects during the process of administering a program or anything that they are doing. I'll give you an example of it. For example, the MG Narega data, that is, the data automatically comes in the back end by the design of the program. Or for example, the school meal program, the midday meal program, or the ICDS, for example, or electrification program, or for example, the sanitation campaign. This is like the ministry maintains the data. So many toilets have been built. So we know that this is a data that comes from the ministry in the sense, administrative data. Administrative data is generally the least reliable, because there is a pressure from the administration to produce a number which is satisfactory to the people who are paying for it. And that is why you will find all of that. But even there, which is like a completely bumped up number and all of that, you have now seen a number of these information which were available in public domain quite easily are now being blocked. You are not being allowed to access those data, including by RTI queries. These are basic statistics that is available to them. But a best example of this is, I think, the administrative data is the tax data. The tax data is something which is compiled by the Ministry of Finance, and since 1950, in fact before that also, but 1950 onwards, we have been releasing a publication handbook where there used to be a compilation of the tax statistics. In the sense, how many people are paying statistics, by which category, by which income, by all of that information was very thoroughly, it was like a bound volume that used to come very regularly every year. That tax statistics was a very useful one. Nobody had a problem. In 1999, Thomas Piketty, French scholar who works on inequality and generally works on tax data, he wrote a paper with Abhijit Banerjee, who got the Nobel Prize recently, on using the tax data to say that India has become a high inequality country. And the next year, government banned the data. The whole publication was abandoned. You can't have access to that data. It took us a long campaign by many people to basically finally put pressure on the Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramaniam. I mean, where every forum people would basically plan and embarrass him, saying that you're not releasing the data, you're hiding the data, you're hiding the data. And finally got embarrassed and he released the data. And he released the data, and the numbers that came out showed that inequality has gone up even further. And the government this time decided, no more discussion. We are never going to release the income tax statistics. Now this is, I'm telling you, this whole denial which is now in different dimensions which is working. But this is not this government alone, by the way. This is something which is, we see a pattern for the last 2.5 to 3 decades, roughly from mid-90s onwards, where every government has generally been very scared of any kind of data which is, any kind of statistics which is negative to them. The UPA government, UPA 2 particularly, was notorious for that, not much different in that sense. The NFHS, the National Family Health Survey data, which brings the malnutrition data, that is done every 5 years. The last one was in 2005. Next one was supposed to happen in 2010-11, and the UPA 2 government blocked it. So we have the next one happening in 2015-16, which is after 10 years, not after 5 years, which is normally happening. There is an international survey called PISA surveys. The PISA survey is basically for measuring the level of students, school students, how much you have learned, in a sense. I mean, whether you can do multiplication, you can read, write, all sorts of things. In 2009, the government basically entered the PISA international survey. It is done by an international agency. And the government basically that time was very careful. It decided that we will send the best states in the survey. So they said you can't do it for the entire country. You can only do it for Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh. These are the 2 states which by education standards do the best. It just happened that our scores was the last in the list of countries which were there. And the government again said nothing doing. We are not getting involved with this anymore. And so they stopped the PISA surveys from then onwards. Now recently there was some pressure, and they were saying that now that we become so popular in the world, you might try it again, and maybe this time you can get a different number. So we might actually get into the PISA ones. So that's a denial part of it, which is now has gone to the extent of where even existing surveys are withdrawn. You are not likely to have a census. Administrating data, it depends on what kind of result you produce. If any result is against me, you can't have the data. That is plain and simple, no more discussion, nothing like that. The second is discredit. And that's something which is again a massive exercise. I mean, if you think that the troll armies are any better in terms of putting out propaganda, you haven't even seen the ability they have in terms of dismantling the existing credibility of the existing databases. The first one was obviously the example that I earlier gave, which is on the employment statistics that came on 2019 January. And the entire Niti Aayog was on press conference, entire Niti Aayog. From the deputy chairperson at that point of time, Rajiv Kumar, who was saying, what kind of data is this? I have not seen this kind of a data, all sorts of things. To the CEO of Niti Aayog at that point of time, a gentleman called Amitabh Kant, who said, how can we have a sampling which is only 100,000 households in a country of 140 crores? So somebody would have gone and told him, sir, this is how statistics is done. If you had read a little bit of whatever in your undergrad or postgrad days, you would not be asking this kind of a question, because all the other claims that you are making also are based on the same statistics. But then that's something which was done, and ministers came in, everybody basically saying, including the Prime Minister, who made a statement on the employment statistics, that that's a propaganda by their own Ministry of Statistics. That was something which was done in an election rally, in fact 2 election rallies where he made that this is all propaganda. And the government, after winning the elections, within a week released the same report saying everything is fine till the next elections. Then we will decide whether data is good or bad, or quality is good or bad, and then we will decide on that. But that brings me to the question of denial again, employment data, why there was so much debate. What people did not notice, that before that government, before the leaked report came out and the discredit part was going on, the government had actually had 4 different forms of employment data, which is fair enough. And in 2008 they added 2 more series of data, because 2008 was the financial crisis part. Government was very keen to understand which are the sectors which are affected by the financial crisis. You know, remember the financial crisis had a long impact of it. So they asked the Labour Bureau that, can you do 2 more surveys? So they started something which is called a quarterly survey of enterprises and an annual survey of employment and unemployment. In 2016, the annual employment survey came out, and it showed that the total number of workers in the economy has come down, and a letter was shot to the Labour Bureau that stop doing all the nonsense, no more surveys. The 5th survey was supposed to be 2015-16. Before that, all the data was available. 15-16, they said, you made a mistake, you brought out a report, but don't bring out the data. So nobody has the data of that one. The quarterly survey was also disbanded, saying, what is the point of doing all of this? In any case, we are coming with all sorts of wrong data. So what is the point of doing all sorts of things? So they stopped all of that. But the discredit part is actually becoming now a concerted effort, that any data which is inconvenient, any statistics which is inconvenient, you can basically, and it is not a joke. I mean, at one point of time, the BJP president had claimed that our WhatsApp army is so strong that we can actually make you believe anything that we want. That is true. So now, the propaganda is the one which is basically is the official statistics. And there is a concerted campaign. So the discredit part is one example I'll give you, and then I'll move to the other part, which is the poverty estimates. So 2017-18 consumption survey showed that the poverty numbers have gone up, and therefore you should be, so the data was basically withheld. And to the extent that they basically launched an inquiry as to how the data was leaked. Every computer in the National Statistical Office in Calcutta was checked, every pen drive was checked, all sorts of things were done. Some kind of a psychosis was put in for data, for publicly available report. It was not a financial inquiry, it was not the Enforcement Directorate, it was not the CBI, but just for the fact that a report, government approved report, was leaked, they introduced full army there. So now if you go to the NSS office there, everybody is so scared. But so leaks have stopped, that's one thing which has worked. But the poverty numbers, that is where the discredit part comes in. You can't have a number which shows that the poverty numbers have come down very drastically. So you basically discredit the entire data part of it. There won't be any data on poverty, and therefore there will not be any discussion on it. And this is something which has been going on for quite some time. The last government, the UPA government, 2 government had set up a committee on Rangarajan, under C. Rangarajan, and he basically set up a committee as to how to measure poverty. He was basically being a very nice person, So he had written the report, but he thought that the UPA 2 is anyway going, the new government is coming, the Modi government is coming, so we'll give the report to the new government. So they gave the report, they withheld the report, they did not submit the report in February or March when they could have. They submitted the report in June or July of 2014. And from that time onwards, nobody knows where the report is. Government refused to react to it. So it has neither been confirmed nor been denied, so nobody knows what is the status of it. But it created a parallel stream of other people who started questioning the very basis of the consumption expenditure data. That the 17-18 data is wrong, the entire methodology of poverty estimation is wrong, all sorts of questions were being, and these are being talked about by really senior people using data that this doesn't match with the national accounts data. So there is a fictitious debate was created. A debate which was settled 40 years back was brought back again, saying that the national accounts numbers and the national sample survey numbers don't match, and therefore the poverty numbers are wrong. Now I am not getting into the whole thing, but if you have questions, I'll tell you what is wrong with this kind of a thing. But this approach of discrediting the data, in a sense, is something which has been going on for a number of data sources, including from the national accounts data itself. Every time a national account survey database, the base changes, a new series of national accounts is created, a back series is created. The government appointed a committee to create a back series. Its own committee, selected people that they have picked up. Poor fellows, they didn't do anything wrong, but they basically created the back series which showed that the growth rates in the previous period was higher than the growth rate that the current period had. Immediately the government said that no more, this cannot go on. That report was there on the website for exactly 76 hours. After 76 hours, that report was withdrawn. They were told that we didn't ask you to do this. We actually have set up another committee which will go give us another report. That committee gave a report which showed that, okay, things are not that bad. Previous government was bad. Our government is not that bad compared to that. And I think the last, in a sense, axis in that sense is the, what we call as divert, in a sense, or deflect, in a sense, which again is, if you ask question to me on something, on a particular number, if you ask question to me about poverty, and this is very common, what we call as in journalistic language, whataboutery, in a sense. But what about growth? Aren't we the fastest growing economy? Aren't we doing so well? India is the Vishwaguru. India is doing so well. India is, if you ask them that motorcycle sales are lower than 2013-14. Oh, but you know, the SUV sales, we are the highest. The four-wheeler sales are the highest that we have, which is actually not the fact. But you will find, and everybody has an anecdote. That, do you know, when I used to travel from Hyderabad airport, that used to be very empty in 2013-14. Now I go, it is so crowded, there is no place, because so many people who are flying in in aeroplanes. So either they will give you another statistics which comes from somewhere else, unverified, or they will give you an anecdotal evidence which you can't refute, because I mean your anecdote is as good as your anecdote. I mean, like, I can't question it. I mean, like, if you're feeling cold here in this hot summer, you're free to do so, but I can't say that no, you're not. That's kind of a story that is going on. So this is something which has gone on, and I can give you 100 examples of it, where again, unemployment statistics, they tried doing this. The whole pakoda economy came from there. That after all, everybody is, I mean, even people who are selling pakodas are, but they are counted as employed. It's not that they are not counted as unemployed. And that is the interview where the Prime Minister, this is the interview that was given by the Prime Minister. So if you ask them, but economy is not doing well, but Uber cars have gone up in the, you see so many Uber cars are there. If you ask them what is happening here, they will say something else. If you ask them that so many people are dying, no, but see, this is what has happened to you. So ultimately it's difficult to win that battle. But if you ask them how many people actually migrated during the COVID regime, the government goes to the court and says, we don't have any data. How much note was recovered by the RBI during the first demonetization? It took 3 RTIs, 1 court intervention to get the data after almost 11 months. That is something which is like, I mean, the data was real time available and the government was releasing it. but it took 11 months for them to finally release the actual number of data. We still don't know if people actually, government went to the court and saying that I don't know how many people migrated. I mean, like, you saw people walking on the streets, you saw thousands of people walking for thousands of kilometers to their home, but we can't give you the number. Why? Because we didn't count. And therefore, it's not our responsibility to give you the number. So I think the question here is, should you be bothered about it? And I think the point that I'm arguing is that all of you should be bothered about it. It is not about an economist working on the data. It is not about the professional researchers working on the data. It is not about journalists working on the data. Journalists have now created a new wing, which is data journalism. There's a new division in journalism. When I had to go and ask one of them that what is data journalism, as if the people who did the previous journalism didn't work on data, or they basically were talking about fiction and you people are working on facts. Is that the difference? Or because I mean, a lot of debate has been created by journalists earlier, and they all were talking about the same thing. So this data journalism, I don't, but this is something which is there. But statistics, data, facts are not for research purposes. They are not for consumption for your academic debates alone. They determine your day-to-day living. They are essential for your participation in democracy. Because the official statistics, the important job of that is also to use independent, credible statistical evidence to question the government. And unless you are able to question the government based on hard facts, your participation in democracy is limited. And therefore, it is your right to have an independent statistical evidence which is credible, unbiased, and it is accessible to you. I don't know whether there is a word called right to statistics or right to data or right to, I don't know what kind of a word can be used, but it should be a democratic right. I should be able to question my government as to say that the number that you are saying is not correct. Your estimates of GDP, I am not buying it. Your estimates of all this thing, I am not buying it. And as a voter, if I am supposed to know the performance of the government or the political parties, then it is my right to have that unbiased information, and it should be made available to me. Otherwise, the entire democratic process is compromised. If I go by the information that you are giving me, and I can't question it, then my participation in the democracy is meaningless. Unfortunately, there is hardly any protest or debate, or even, I mean, you will not find any newspaper columnist also writing about this thing. You will find hundreds of them writing how the media has become compromised, there is a institutional failure, all sorts of things, how the judiciary has become, all of that. But this particular thing, it doesn't come into your sphere. Nobody wants to talk about it, because for you, that is not part of your life. It is only when somebody is doing research, then it is important. But it is important, and I'll end with basically giving two examples, and then probably we can have a longer time on this. The last, most recent in a period, the big debate has been on something which is called the socio-economic caste census, where suddenly there is a debate that has come up, because census is likely to happen at some point of time, and they would like the caste to be included as part of the census. In our census, religion has been there from the first time, 1881, when the census has been there, religion has been there. Caste was also there. After independence, it was decided that caste will not be there, in the sense, except for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Scheduled caste, there is subcaste which is there. I mean, which particular scheduled caste you belong to, you have to basically, that is enumerated. That's something which is very detailed, available. Same is the case with the scheduled tribe. For the remaining ones, that is not something which is, that information is not available. That is why one says that the data is actually political. The British, one of the reasons why the British had the religion angle and the caste angle is not because they were so much interested in anthropology of India, or for example, they were very much interested in elimination of caste or something like this. They wanted to use the data to do what they wanted to do earlier also and have been doing, which is a divide and rule. I mean, like the whole Bengal, division of Bengal in 1905, I mean, that data became handy. So statistics has been used for good purposes as well as for bad purposes, and one of the examples of that the Muslim population will be here, the Hindu population will be here, that kind of religious. So that religion information was important. The caste information was also important to bring in that whole issue of caste, where the colonial government was playing a role. We decided 1950 onwards that only scheduled caste will be collected, rest will not be collected. But then after that, the OBC, the demand for OBC reservation comes in, and the demand for counting caste, the OBC, how much is the population of the OBC, other backward castes, it basically started in the 1960s. From then onwards, this demand has been going on, and in fact, the Mandal Commission, one of the main recommendations of the Mandal Commission was that you should have caste as part of the caste census. You can't have OBC reservation without knowing how much population is there in the OBC reservation. Finally, it came to the VP Singh government when Mandal Commission was introduced, and then the Indira Sahni case, the Supreme Court basically fixed an arbitrary number of that it can't be more than 49%, so 27% is being given to you. Since then, the debate has been going on. I mean, like, you should know, I mean, how much is to there. And in 2010, finally, all parties agreed, and it was agreed that the caste will be included as part of the census. But very strategically, the government took some time to decide it. And by then they said, look, the census process has already started, so I can't include it. So we will include it as part of the socio-economic caste census, which is another census that was being conducted at that point of time. But the caste data will be kept separate and will be released separately. The data has not been released so far. Since 2015, the data has been lying with the government. Denial is first part of it. The data is not available to anybody. Obviously, discrediting the data, this series went on, data quality is bad, all of that is there. But they are on the record in the parliament saying that there is no problem with the data. Data is 99 point some % correct. There is absolutely no problem with the data. And finally, the whole issue was that why do you need caste information? That's that kind of a thing. The Karnataka government, the Congress Karnataka government did the same thing. They conducted their own caste census, but they developed cold feet and they did not release the data. Now they have decided they will release it after this UPA government has come in. The Bihar government is also doing its own caste census. I don't know whether they will release it or not. But even today, nobody knows the caste census will be there as part of the population census or not. The parties which were saying that caste census should not be there as part of population census are now saying that what is the point of it? Why do you want to know the numbers? Information is bad. Why? Because if you get the information, it might lead to political mobilization. That is the only fear. And data has been used for political mobilization for good as well as for bad. But that is no reason for anybody to stop or to not do any data counting in that exercise. So again, this whole issue of how you treat a particular official statistics is not just, it's a highly political one, and your politics depends on the data, whether you are a participant directly in it or indirectly in it. And it is a matter of public discussion, which is what is not there, and that's the point I wanted to make, sir. But I think the idea of having a statistical system, independent statistical system, is not something which is new. We have been discussing it for quite some time. We have a National Statistical Commission which is supposed to be, there is a National Statistical Commission bill which is supposed to give it an independent statutory status and all of that stuff. But that is not yet seen the day. That's since last 15 years. That is something which has been going on, because nobody wants to give powers to or independence to the authority which can give you independent data, because that's something which, it's like I mean, it's a suicidal kind of a thing. Nobody would like to do that. No government is going to have any consensus on that. But I think as citizens, it is our right. As citizens, it is our basic constitutional right to be able to, if a candidate contests elections, he is required to give his all the cases that he has there and whatever, or educational qualifications, assets, everything which is there. But that also came through courts and all of that. But I think we need to know. I mean, this is something which you can evaluate as far as the political the candidate is concerned. But if I want to evaluate a government, I need to have access to those ones. I'm not saying that the political party should, in an affidavit, say that as when we were in government, this is what we did. But we need to have that independent statistical information. Because if we don't have that statistical information, then on what basis are we voting for the political parties? I mean, after all, it is not a beauty contest. We are voting for certain things that they claim to do, or they would like to do that. But who judges it? And various discussions can be there on this, and there have been discussions in various other countries, and I'm not getting into it. But just to say that there are certain preconditions. One is the data should be available. That should be a basic right. All sorts of data. It should be accessible. Not just because it is available to you doesn't mean that it is accessible to me. It should be accessible. And the statistical system should be accountable to the public, not to the government. We should be able to ask the statistical system that why have you done this and why you have not done this. Some questions can be asked. Otherwise, we will get into a situation where every time we want some information, then we are at the mercy of it. I'll give you one example of it, which is the second example. Finally, the 2017-18 consumption expenditure data is a very interesting example of it, because they decided very quickly that they are not going to use it, but they didn't think about the repercussions of it. They thought that, okay, poverty numbers are not going to come out, let's be happy about it. They didn't realize that everything in this country, the official statistics in this country, almost everything depends on the consumption expenditure data. The poverty estimates are actually only an incidental part of it. Your price indices are dependent on consumption expenditure data. Why? Because you need weight of different items of consumption. And therefore, this time the RBI basically suddenly realized when inflation went up to 6%, 6.5%, then they started saying again discredited thing, this whole CPI numbers are wrong. We have been raising the interest rate, we have raised it to repo rate to 6.5%, inflation is not coming down. There are only two possibilities. Either the inflation numbers are wrong, because we can't be wrong. So what we have done is correct, so the inflation numbers must be wrong, or there is something else which is going on. Now the CPI numbers are not wrong, I mean, that they also realize. But the reason why the CPI numbers have not been updated is because there is no consumption survey. And they suddenly realize, but who stopped the consumption survey? And then somebody has to remind them that you were the person who were responsible for stopping that consumption survey. Or for example, the GDP data. You can't revise the GDP data because one of the important ingredients of the GDP data is consumption survey. So you can't have a GDP revision because the consumption survey is not available. So finally the government at some point of time realized that life cannot go on if you don't have the consumption survey. We have to have the consumption survey. So decided to have a consumption survey. The consumption survey was happening 22 to 23. Started last year July, and everybody was so excited that okay, finally we'll have the poverty numbers. But then government realized that okay, we are doing consumption survey, somebody might use it for poverty estimate, then what will we do? So they said we are going to have a unique method of it. This time the consumption survey will be 2-year consumption survey, because the results will come out in 2025. After that you do whatever you want to do, but we are not giving you the data before 2025. So it's something which is where it's a cat and mouse game. The point is why am I bothering you with all the technical details? Because those technical details are the ones which are going to affect you. Whether you get your subsidy, whether you get your electricity, whether you get your expenditure, who is going to benefit out of it, your public expenditure, your allocation of finance commission allocation across states, how much you are going to get out of it, it depends on those numbers. Just before the elections, everybody will say the center is mistreating us, center is mistreating us. But because we don't have those numbers, because those numbers are manipulated, because we have built up a whole ecosystem, we have destroyed the credibility of those official statistics. Finally, it is my word versus your word. I think just as we are so concerned about the demise of the media, judicial system, independence of the financial institutions and various other things, I think this issue is probably, if not more important, equally important, not for research purposes or to be able to make sense of what is going on in the economy, but the simple reason that any functioning democracy requires an independent statistical system, reliable, trustworthy, free from any government control. And it is not too much for asking. It's not something which is cost anything or something which is there. But I think it's something should be as fundamental a right as anything else if the democracy has to be a functioning democracy as we call it. I'll stop here at this point of time, and then probably if there are questions, I'll take it.
There are a number of private agencies which have stepped in. What was the implications of that, and maybe you could share with us the veracity of those statistics, whether that is a viable alternative in the interim, or that is also something to be tried.
States obviously do have, when nobody stops them from collecting data. The only problem is that they will not be able to generalize it beyond their state. So that and actually in most of in fact the statistical system is a very good example of how the federal structure works. The National Sample Survey Organization always had what we call as the matching sample. So whatever is the total number of households that were served by the central government, exactly the same number was served by the state government. So it was seen as participatory, and they were in some cases they were allowed to go beyond that to create your own estimate. You are actually allowed to create their own estimate. When state governments were doing that, it's a different matter that no state government ever bothered about using the state. I think Telangana was one of the states where they tried doing it. Professor Radhakrishna and C. Ravi, they tried to get some kind of an estimate from the state sample. But it is still collected. Even today it is something which is collected because some things in history don't change. Private sector sources, I am still, I'm a little bit suspect of, not very confident about those ones, because for me the test of the data is that it should be in public domain, in the sense, should be able to verify. And if it is not following the criteria of being available, accessible and accountable, then I don't think that's something which is going to work. And obviously the collapse of the public sector has led to the vacuum being created where the public, all sorts of private sector services have come in. For example, there is a CMI which is now producing all sorts of numbers, right from employment to consumption expenditure, but less said than better. They are not reliable. There are several problems with those ones, and they are not willing to answer those questions. So as long as that is not happening, we can't say that those numbers are substitute for them. Obviously some numbers will come out of it, but I don't think those are substitute for it. Secondly, I think the whole purpose of having those official statistics, it cannot be served by a private party. Tomorrow the private party may decide to do something else. I can't take that as a benchmark. So I think they can't be substitute for it, but more the number, more the data is something which is definitely better, because this can be used to question the official statistics. There's price data that's the consumption data that is market consumer agencies, they bring out of those ones. But I think there are also other private agencies, private surveys, and they have done quite good work. For example, the data that is collected, administrative data, what we call it as data collected by Uber during the process of their running, or for example Zomato, for example, or for example other ones. Uber, for example, can give you good data, and this is something which has been done in other places in some of the European countries, because they tell you about the traffic flow that can help you manage traffic flows quite easily, but they can also tell you what exactly is happening where. So I think some of the private sources are, and they are more available than the private surveys in that sense. So I think we should take advantage of the private data sources, but I don't think they're substitute of the official ones.
I am Dr. Chakravarti, retired civil servant. Thank you, Mr. Himanshu, for your great presentation. The data, they call it today as the new oil. The crude oil is not that precious as data is. Data is precious. For which, under international pressure rather than national pressure, the government of India is now working on what is known as a data protection bill, which is linked to privacy also, data issues. But if you read the draft, there were 4 iterations of draft. The goalpost has been changing for the last 2-3 years. 4 versions of the same act has come up. The final one, approved by the cabinet, is now pending to be introduced to the parliament. What does it say? I take only 1 or 2 minutes on this. Data protection has got 2 dimensions. One, protection of the data from an individual point of view, consumer point of view, and that. We give some health data, we give some education kinds of things. All this data is very precious. And I don't want this to be misused or abused by anybody. So I want a protection that is available in the draft act. But what is not available? The draft does not say that even vis-a-vis the government, the data can be protected. What all it says is, it actually protects the government. It says government, in its own interest, in public interest, can say no to some data, yes to some data. Now, this is what is really affecting my equanimity in the sense that when you say in public interest, who is the public? You and I. When you say in public interest I go to withhold the data, then where am I? Where do I start? Now the data protection draft which is there says in public interest they can do all these things. I would like to know from you, Mr. Himanshu, as to whether there is any move from the populace, as we call it, to say that this protection should not be given to the government adverse to public interest, even though they say it is in public interest.
I entirely agree with you. I mean, I think that is why there was a mechanism which was there, that the data was supposed to be, the entire custodian of the data was supposed to be what is called a National Statistical Commission, which is an independent body like the CAG or like various other independent bodies which are enacted by the parliament and only accountable to the parliament. Only they can basically do that. And that bill also has not seen there's no progress on this. I don't think the government should be given the right to decide what is good for the public and not good for the public. If they are interested party, I mean, there is obviously, one can basically have some kind of an independent body to look at it. National Statistical Commission is a good body of it. And in fact, the census also should become part of it. In the sense, it should not be the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is an anomaly in the sense, nowhere in the world is a census conducted by Ministry of Home Affairs except in India. In most other countries, census is part of a statistical system. It's a basic statistics. Only in India, it is where we have the Home Ministry conducting the national population census in that sense. But I think the question will always be there. I mean, despite all the safeguards. That is why I think some kind of building public awareness and making the whole effort towards having an independent statistical body is far more important than getting these bits and pieces of benefit from the state, because they will find different ways of defining, stopping the data.
I am Statistical, and I beg to submit my apologies to many learned persons here. Even when the data is being published, see, today we see headline, India is the fastest growing economy. And that paragraph, then India, the latest growth rate is 7.2%. I have read the whole report in business line in Hindu. And you say that 7.2%, you are very good. The number is good. But 7.2% on what base? When India is a $3 trillion economy, and China is $17 trillion economy, nobody tells. See, the growth, 7.7% growth, nobody tells. Even another example I will give you. This El Nino came. El Nino is there, rains are delayed, but IMD gives a prediction that the monsoon is normal. And normally, all of people are from Hyderabad here, on Mrugasar Karti day, it rains. It rains for 5 minutes in Hyderabad. But yesterday and today, we are experiencing terrible heat. See, even where data is published, there is a lot of, what is that? Some manipulation is there. Even nobody, in fact somebody asked me this question. I told, see, it is true that India is fastest growing economy, but what on base? What about poverty? What about inequality? Nobody asked these questions. Thank you very much, sir. Only thing is, these things have to be highlighted by the media in headlines also.
Mr. Himanshu, you have really touched on the heart and quite clearly you ignited our minds. Okay? I need to know from what exactly. One question which you have put and could not complete, I just wanted to know the financial crisis of 2008 leading to the labor bureau and the environment. Could you just elaborate on that? Number one. Number two, can you just throw light on what was the subsidy that had happened for decades together and what's the state now? Subsidies that were given on different aspects. Subsidies.
Yeah. The entire central government.
Right from the beginning, from the decades together, and how it is now.
I have absolutely no, like last 70 years, I have to look at the budget numbers to tell you what is the percentage of subsidy that went into it. But I think the question that was there on the 2008 financial crisis. So when the 2008 financial crisis happened, then the government basically wanted to know which are the sectors which are affected by the financial crisis. And that is why they started two surveys. One was a general population survey, what we call as the labor surveys, the annual labor survey, which is the total workforce in the economy, and which is the second part is what they started with, what is called an enterprise survey, where they were looking at not just the laborers but also at the enterprises. I mean, how many enterprises are increasing. So the enterprise survey was a quarterly survey. The labor survey was an annual survey, which is what a government should be doing. I mean, responding to. I mean, it used to be earlier also. For example, in beginning of the 98-99, when there was farmer suicides that started happening, the government responded and started a new survey called the Situation Assessment Survey of Farmers. It wanted to know exactly what is happening in that sense. But then that survey was both the employment and unemployment survey in that sense was continued up to 2016, and then after that, immediately after the demonetization, some people started using the data, saying that the enterprises have been impacted, or labor, for example, is not doing quite well, and both of them were shut down. So we don't have any more surveys. Now they have started the survey, the quarterly survey, restarted last year, although the annual employment survey is no longer being conducted by the Labor Bureau. For a normal human, normal civilization, it is impossible that you can. That is why before our political journey, before we had the first elections, we had our statistical system functioning much before that. In fact, the first national income estimates were for 1948-49. And the entire process of building up the statistical system predates the first election in 1951, because we needed it. We needed that data. I mean, for any government, the data is important. I mean, unless how do you make policies? But yes, I mean, for some governments, they can make policies otherwise also. So it depends on what kind of a government you are talking about. The second, I think, is the question is important. There have been massive improvements in data collection. Now, a lot of data collection is happening in handheld devices, which is it's called the CAPI, computer assisted, and they do it in tablets. They are much more sensitive towards gender issues. They are much more sensitive about various kinds of data. Or, for example, when they are collecting the data, they cross-check it with various other data. For example, the GSD data, which is a minefield. Or, for example, the toll data or various other data. So, there are lots of big data is being used by the statistical agencies, by the official agencies to improve the quality of the data. But that has nothing to do with government's effort or government's ability to stop the data from being released. You can do all of this, get a very good quality data, but ultimately the signing authority of whether data will be released in the public or not, that remains with the government. And that is something which has nothing to do with the quality of the data inherent in it, but whether data is in my favor or it is not in my favor.
Now, what I understood from today's talk, that the government or maybe the agencies, whichever agencies are involved, they're indulging or whatever. There are first discredit and denial, discredit, and then divert. In addition to that, do you see any tendencies of designing the process of collecting data so that the desired results are obtained by the agencies?
Yes. Actually, you're right. I mean, I got your question wrong. Yeah, but there is an attempt to do that also, where you basically change the way you are collecting data to basically get a particular system of. I mean, the present consumption expenditure survey is a good example of that. In the sense, it's a one in a kind in the world. I mean, it has never ever been attempted in the last 100 years of statistical history ever in the world. I mean, to get a higher consumption number or a lower poverty estimates, for the first time the government is doing a consumption survey where the same questionnaire is being asked 3 times. So January the questionnaire will be asked one part of the questionnaire, the second part of the questionnaire will be asked in February, the third part will be asked in March. They have separated the entire questionnaire into 3 parts. It has never been done. I mean, it's not something which has ever been attempted or even thought about it.
But there could be a point there. Generally, it is used for checking the consistency.
No, but it's not the same questions. It's the same questionnaire. For example, if I ask you questions about 3 parts of it, like say for example, how much is your food consumption, how much is your services consumption, and how much of your durable consumption. So January I ask your food consumption, February I ask you something else, March I ask something else. There now the statistical agency thought that by doing this, we might get a higher number. I mean, normally when they do some kind of a pilot. This time they didn't do the pilot also. They just decided that this is how we are going to get a higher number. Now they are running the problem where some people have done it for first month, second month, third month they are saying I am not going to answer. Or the third month people have shifted away. I mean, particularly in rural areas where the people go for seasonal migration. For example, May and June is when what we call as the lean period of agriculture. So people go to work in non-agriculture in brick kilns, because brick kiln activity is much higher here. So they get to some other village, some other district, some other place. So you have done for March and April, but May you don't find the person. Or for example, you don't find the person in May and June, and suddenly the person appears in July. So we are getting into this kind of a complete mockery of the entire statistical system. But yes, there has been effort, and I am not going to bore you with that. But they have tried all tricks in the trade to get higher numbers. It didn't work.
No, actually, I had a question on data manipulation. Really take off from what I'm asking you about. Because this data is disaggregated and collected from a large variety of sources, and there will be a statistical model to finally come to a certain conclusion. At what point in time is it possible to manipulate the result of the data at all? Is it in the model, or is it denial the only way?
That's the problem. That is what the government is struggling with. There are 2 pillars of the entire statistical system. One is the quality of our statistical system as such. It's quite robust, and it is sitting on a 70-year-old historical data, but also institutional memory and everything. So you can't corrupt the individual. I mean, for that you will have to basically find the investigator who is doing it in a particular village in Rajasthan and go and bribe him. That's something which is too much of an effort. So you can't do that much of an effort. Second is the instruments that you use, which is the questionnaire or something. These are again where a lot of effort has gone into it, a lot of exercise has gone into it, testing the validity of all of these issues have gone into it. So you can't immediately tamper with it, but obviously they can in a sense. The problem is that if they could manipulate the data, then they did not have to withdraw the 2017-18 consumption data. They could have put in their own number. The problem was that they were unwilling, I mean the statistical system was unwilling to change those numbers. The statistical system stood their ground saying that these are the numbers, if it has to be released, these are the numbers. You have the option of withdrawing it. That's what the government did. So I think very difficult to tamper at the lower level, but at the top level you can actually change the questionnaire, you can change the methodology of it, but numbers can't be changed.
Hello, I'm Dinesh. So my question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is the accuracy of the data? See, we cannot expect 100% perfect, but to what extent the accuracy of the data is there? And second thing is that the data is primary and secondary both, or what?
I mean, mostly it is the data which is collected by the, so they're the investigators who go and collect the sample surveys are primary surveys where people go and collect the data. The secondary surveys are about the administrative data which are collected in those kind of numbers. So multiple data sources are used. The question is not about the validity. I mean, like to be able to say that the data is wrong, you need to have some counterfactual to say that this is the right data. I mean, there might be problems with the data. All data will have some kind of a problems. But as long as they are done with the proper statistical method, by right methodology being followed, proper system has been followed, the data are reliable. All of these sample surveys or aggregate data, I mean, the worst data in the country is the GDP data. If you want to know which is the worst quality data, then the GDP data. But it is by design, because you want a GDP data every quarter, so you are going to get what you are going to get. But that doesn't mean that it is that there is a purposely manipulation that is happening. And I think the question was important for a general public also. None of the international agencies collect data in this country. ILO, WHO, UN, World Bank, IMF, not a single one of them collect data in this country. They all, by the charter of the UN, use a data which is provided by the government of India. They cannot. So you can't have a WHO which is saying different thing from government of India.
What is happening in the data world you have listed out, and I think it's happening in other activities as well. Data is basically an indicator. Which direction are we heading? What are the changes being made? If that be so, even earlier I had a problem that the data would come much later. Actually, as civil society, what would you recommend as the contra-indicators of early learning to maneuver a change?
That's a very, very difficult question to answer. Probably we'll talk after the. But you see, the data lag or what we call as the other indicators in that sense. Sometimes it is not by design. It is something which is part of the process in the sense that it takes that much of time. But I don't think every civil society movement or every civil society exercise has to necessarily depend on the official data. I mean, there are some things for which the data is available. I mean, like there in front of you, and you might probably be able to use that data. I mean, one of my favorite examples of this is that the unemployment data that we get from the official statistics. That's notoriously, I mean, everybody is so using that data. But remember, that data has very limited value. Partly because the way we measure unemployment, and that is something which is very, very difficult in a country like ours, where majority of the population is poor. I mean, if you are poor, and if you have to arrange food every day, unemployment is a luxury you cannot afford. So that's something which you cannot be. So that is why poor cannot be unemployed. So they will do something because they have to, at the end of the day, provide food to the family members in their house. So those unemployment numbers in that sense are not going to, they might be employed in a different way, but that is not captured by your aggregate unemployment numbers. But say, for example, I'll give you another indicator of unemployment. And that something might be in a form of a question, in a sense, which is why I often ask this question. For example, the popular story is, I mean, the three communities, agricultural communities which are been in protest in the last 6-7 years, the Jats, Marathas and the Patels. They're the three richest communities in the three of the richest states, Haryana, Maharashtra and Gujarat, in the three most urbanized states and three most industrialized states. And they are on the street burning buses and fighting for government jobs which don't exist. That's the symbol of unemployment. That is the statistics of unemployment. For that, you don't have to get official statistics. It is there on the street. So I think for civil society, you can find different ways of looking at those indicators. So I'm not saying that you wait for good numbers and correct numbers to be able to. That process is important. There has to be linked in that, but I don't think that is one precedes the other or one is.
Does it mean that proxies serve the business of us? Can we use proxies?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you don't have to wait for government of India to come and tell you that there are poor people in this country, or you don't have to come and wait for the government of India to tell you in the Supreme Court that based on our records, we don't have the number of people who walked during the COVID period of time, or the number of people who died because of oxygen shortage. These are the numbers that the government said. You don't have to wait for it. You saw what is happening there. I mean, can't simply tomorrow come and say that, look, I don't know the official statistics, so what can I do for that? So I think some things don't require official statistics.
Hi, Himanshu. I have two questions. The first is that you keep discrediting government data on the one hand, and on the other hand, you say that you can only trust government data. How do you reconcile these two positions? That's the first. The second is that a lot of government policies, for example, EWS reservations, the OBCs, the inclusion of some classes within the OBCs, etc., are all based on government statistics. Now, how are the changes, in fact, EWS brought recently, how are these changes being brought about without any data at all? So, how are these policies being brought about if there's no data?
First of all, I'm not discrediting the official statistics. I'm saying the official statistics is doing a wonderful job, and despite all the efforts to discredit them, they have their standing. They're still doing what they're supposed to do. So what I'm criticizing is the government interference, politicizing a statistical process for the political purposes, which I think is the wrong thing to do. The question should be answered by, that's a question, the right question. Nobody has the information as to where is the 8 lakh income criteria for EWS comes from. Nobody has the information. This is government's affidavit in the Supreme Court. The OBC reservation or EWS reservation, all of these are based on a completely imagination of the government. There is absolutely no data to back it up, and that is what I am asking. So what is wrong with it in asking that have information, let the public decide, let it be a public debate. Whether somebody, the criteria should be 8 lakh or 10 lakh, whether we should have an EWS or not EWS, we should have a debate on these issues. Information is not the enemy. We should be guarding about misuse of information.
Thriving economies, local governance and community support are major reasons why those democracies are able to work. But in India, I guess we are missing that. So, in the current issue which you are talking about, what can we do as a society, as a community, to ensure that data transparency is there and the right data is being published to take the policies?
That's very difficult for me to, but you see, I think you should be, this is a basic right. You should be able to demand the government, hold the government to accountable on basic questions as to how many people are unemployed, how many people are poor, how many people are dying of hunger, how many people died of lack of oxygen, how many people are dying. These are basic information you need to know. And asking those questions is not, for that you should not be called anti-national or should be asked any question. That's a proper right, you should do that.
Yeah, no.
Hi sir, I wish to know, is there any other country which is just like India, that is democratic in nature and yet is able to have good data accountability and transparency? And yes, how are they able to do it, and what is that we are unable to do it?
Number of examples. Let me give you. France, for example, has a good statistical system, which is the head of the statistical agency does not even listen to ministers. They produce the statistical data and they are independent. Whatever numbers they produce, they can't be questioned on that. And they produce those numbers. I'm giving one example of it. In most places, the head of the statistical agencies are given constitutional protection. France is one example of it. Or let me give you a very interesting example of it, which is Finland. Well, this is true for all the Nordic countries, but Finland, every year on 1st of November or 30th of November, they make it public, all the taxpayer data. Everybody's tax data is made public by law. By law. And they do it. There were obviously people who are angry that why are you making my data public, why the tax should have been. But then that's something which is there and they do it by public. So they do it, they see it as a purpose that this is public's right to know, and then they do it. And there again they are protected. In Sweden, in Germany, in various other places, the statistical system is obviously something which is seen as very sacrosanct. I mean, we don't want to be in a situation where, like people used to say about that this is Chinese data, and we don't want to be, but we are heading into that direction and we should be guarding towards that.
So why didn't our constitution make this a constitutional body when they were making it? Why didn't they envisage this for us? Just like CAG or UPS?
Our constitution makers didn't imagine many other things. I mean, this was not one of the things. They never thought that at one point of time you will be actually misusing the system. I mean, if they thought about it, they probably would have done it. But at that point of time, it was seen as a very sacrosanct. Nobody interfered, and they did bring out all sorts of information which was uncomfortable to the government. And in the Congress government in 50s, 60s, in the 1950s, they brought out all sorts of uncomfortable data. Nobody ever bothered about it. And there is, even in the NDA government, I must tell you that there is the Vajpayee government, for example. In 1999-2000, the consumption survey that came out that led to the Great Indian Poverty debate and all sorts of things. The finance minister at that point of time had the courage to come out in the parliament and say that mistakes have been committed, this data cannot be used because the researcher community is asking those questions. We will not use the data, but we will conduct a data again fresh based on the conditions that have been previously been there. But they didn't withdraw the data. They didn't say that you can't use the data. They allowed the data to be used by international community. In fact, number of international Nobel Prize winners worked on their data and many other people worked on that data. So that was a different time.
Sir, the elections are next year, and somehow I feel for next 10 years this government is going to last. What mechanisms have you thought of leaking the data?
Last time there was a leak, then I don't think any other journalist is willing to take that risk of leaking the data anymore. I mean, this is something which is. But I think the only thing that can work is public pressure. I don't think leaking is the solution to this kind of a problem.
Sir, regarding this, the data and whatever, can we make it as a constitutional right for the citizens, as the Kerala government did it, yesterday? Internet is the basic human right. Something like that can be done regarding the data availability to the citizens.
It should be held, I mean, at least the government is by us, it is to be held accountable by us, and it is bound to provide credible, unbiased, reliable information to the public. That should be that's something which is asking for the minimum, basic minimum. I'm not asking that to anything else, but this should be the basic minimum.
I get a feeling that there are no basic human rights now in Africa.
Good evening, sir. By design, data can be collected as they want. If I use the Daniel Kahneman concept, he says, the way you ask the question, you may get the answer. Is it right?
It can be. I mean, that's something which is, there's another famous, many other people who have said that there's manipulating data is not something which is impossible. And we are living in a world where there is fake news is the norm, and truth and facts are the abnormal. So I don't think that's something which is, it depends on your ability to be able to declare anything as truth. I mean, and we see that happening on a day-to-day basis. I mean, sometimes the question to be asked is that why put an effort to discredit the statistical system? We can create a parallel truth without doing all of that. So I think the question is that whether they want to do it or not. But that can be done.
But if everything is going right, we can feel it. If everything is going right, we can feel it also.
There's a line which says that when facts don't suit the theory, alter the facts. I think we close it here. We have had enough